The Montana wind was a relentless thief, stealing warmth from the cabin's old bones and whistling through the gaps in the chinking. Ilara didn't mind. The sound was a familiar companion in the vast, unforgiving quiet of the valley. She finished sharpening her axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel, a small, defiant noise against the coming storm that bruised the sky purple. Her life was a cycle of hard work and solitude, etched into the lines on her hands and the set of her jaw. She'd inherited this land, this isolation, and had worn it like a second skin for 10 years. That's when she saw him. A dark shape stumbling through the tall grass at the edge of her property, collapsing near the split-rail fence. He wasn't a bear or a stray cow. He was a man. Cautiously, rifle in hand, Ilara approached. He was sprawled face down, one arm twisted beneath him. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the back of his shirt, too dark for water. She nudged him with the toe of her boot. A ragged groan was the only answer. Rolling him over, she saw a face pale with pain and exhaustion, a nasty gash on his forehead, but it was the bullet wound in his shoulder, seeping blood, that held her attention. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and desperate. "Please," he rasped, the word barely a whisper against the wind. Every instinct screamed at her to leave him. He was trouble, the kind that brought men with badges and guns. But the raw desperation in his eyes mirrored a loneliness she knew all too well. It was a foolish, dangerous compassion that made her decision. With a grunt of effort, she hauled him to his feet, his weight a deadening burden. She half dragged, half carried him into the cabin, the warmth of the hearth a stark contrast to the cold reality of her choice. After barring the door, she fetched her medical supplies, her hands steady as she cut away the blood-soaked fabric. This was a choice she couldn't take back. Inside the cabin, the world shrank to the flickering halo of a single lantern. The air grew thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sharp tang of whiskey she'd unstoppered from her father's old flask. Ilara worked with a desperate focus, tearing strips from a clean linen sheet her mother had embroidered long ago. Each rip of the fabric felt like a tear in the quiet fabric of her own life. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her stomach churning at the sight of torn flesh. The man groaned, his body arching in a spasm of pain. His eyes, a hazy blue, fluttered open and struggled to focus on her. "Where?" he rasped, his voice a dry crackle of dust and agony. "Hush now. You're safe for the moment," she said, her tone firmer than she felt. "Just stay still." She held a cup of water to his lips, and he drank greedily before collapsing back onto the cot. "What's your name?" she asked softly, needing a name to attach to the chaos he'd brought. He hesitated, his gaze drifting to the dark corners of the ceiling. "Silas," he finally whispered. The name landed like a stone in her gut. She'd seen it on a weathered poster nailed to the post office wall in Redemption. Silas Kane, wanted for armed robbery of a payroll wagon. Not a killer, the poster had said, but dangerous. "They're coming for me," he breathed, his eyes closing again. "The sheriff, he's a persistent man." "I know," Ilara said, the words tasting like ash. The choice was made, the consequences barreling toward her. Just as she secured the last of the bandage, she froze. A faint, rhythmic sound cut through the prairie wind. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, but a group, steady and purposeful. They were close. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She looked wildly around the small room, her eyes landing on the thick, worn planks near the hearth that covered the old root cellar. "Silas, get up," she urged, shaking his shoulder. "You have to hide now." He was a dead weight, barely conscious. With a surge of adrenaline, she heaved him off the cot, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. She strained, half dragging him the few feet to the cellar door. Her fingers fumbled with the iron ring, prying the heavy plank open. A wave of cool, earthy air washed over them. As she guided him into the cramped darkness below, a thunderous knock rattled the cabin door, making her jump. "Ilara, you in there? This is Sheriff Thompson." "Open up." Ilara pulled the door open, just enough to see Sheriff Thompson's weathered face, illuminated by the lantern in his hand. His eyes, sharp, and accustomed to peering through dust and lies, met hers. Behind him, two deputies sat on their horses, their forms dark silhouettes against the moonless sky. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, his voice a low gravel that carried on the biting wind. "Sorry for the late hour. We're tracking a fugitive. Named Silas Kane. Took a bullet. We followed his trail this far before it vanished." He paused, his gaze sweeping past her into the dim cabin. "You haven't seen anyone pass through here, have you?" A man alone, hurt, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat only she could hear. She forced her voice to remain steady, weary. "Sheriff, the only thing that's passed through here tonight is this wind. It's been a quiet evening." She clutched her shawl tighter, a shield against the cold and his scrutiny. "Mind if we come in for a moment, warm our hands?" he asked, though it was less a question than a statement of intent. Before she could refuse, he stepped across the threshold, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. His eyes immediately went to the bearskin rug near the hearth, the very one covering the cellar door. He walked directly toward it, his steps echoing the frantic pulse in her ears. He stopped right on top of it, turning his back to the fire to warm his hands. He's a dangerous man, this Kane. Not the sort of trouble a woman alone should face. Every word was a test, every glance a probe. Ilara felt a cold sweat prickle her hairline. A cough, a groan, a single misplaced sound from below would be her end. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, Thompson turned. He scanned the room one last time, his eyes lingering on the small table where her medical supplies had been just an hour ago. She had scrubbed it clean, but his gaze made her wonder if a trace of blood or the scent of antiseptic still hung in the air. Finally, he nodded curtly. "All right then, sorry to have disturbed you." He walked out, his deputies following. As he mounted his horse, he glanced back at the small cabin one last time, his expression unreadable but chilling. "Keep your door locked, ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying a new, harder edge. The warning hung in the air long after they disappeared into the darkness. The sound of hooves faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. For a full minute, Ilara didn't move, her body rigid, her hand still clutching the handle of the cast-iron skillet she'd grabbed without thinking. The adrenaline that had sharpened her senses now drained away, leaving her weak-kneed and trembling. The cabin, once her sanctuary, felt like a cage. Every shadow seemed to hold the sheriff's accusatory gaze. Taking a ragged breath, she knelt and carefully peeled back the worn wool rug. She slid open the cellar door, a gust of cool, earthy air meeting her. With the lantern held low, she descended the rickety ladder, its rungs groaning under her weight. Silas was propped up against a wall of potato sacks, his eyes open and alert. They held a mixture of pain, exhaustion, and a deep, unnerving awareness. He had heard everything. "He's gone." Silas's voice was a dry rasp, but it was the first time she'd heard him speak a full sentence. Ilara nodded, setting the lantern on a crate. "For now, he doesn't believe me. You should have let him take me," he said, his gaze fixed on the wooden planks above them. "He'll be back. Men like Thompson, they feed on suspicion. And let you die in a ditch or at the end of a rope," Ilara countered, her voice firmer than she felt. She began checking his bandage, her movements practiced and gentle. "Why are they so intent on finding you, Silas?" He was quiet for a moment, watching her. "The poster says bank robbery. It wasn't a bank. It was leverage. A cattle baron named Barlow wants my family's land, the last bit of water access in the whole valley. He framed me for stealing from his payroll to get me out of the way. The shot, that was from one of his men, not a lawman." His story was simple, believable, and far more tragic than the brutal crime on the wanted poster. It settled in Ilara's chest, extinguishing the last flicker of doubt. She saw not an outlaw, but a man fighting a different kind of law, the law of power and greed. "We can't stay here," she said, her decision made. "He'll come back and he won't knock next time. There's an old line shack, high in the coulees about 5 miles from here. It's been abandoned for years. If you can walk, we leave at nightfall." Silas looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time she saw not a fugitive, but a partner in a desperate gamble. He gave a slow, pained nod. At nightfall, the moon was a sliver, veiled by a thin shroud of clouds that did little to obscure the overwhelming emptiness of the Montana plains at night. A chill wind cut across the land, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Ilara pushed the cabin door shut with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She carried a small bundle of supplies, water, bandages, and a piece of dried meat. Her other arm was looped under Silas's, bearing much of his weight. Every step was an agony for him. A low groan escaped his lips as his wounded side protested the movement. "I'm slowing you down," he rasped, his breath misting in the cold air. "Just keep moving," Ilara whispered back, her voice tight with urgency. "The shack isn't far, but we can't stop." They navigated by starlight, moving through the tall grass and around jagged rock formations that cast long, distorted shadows. The landscape that was her sanctuary by day had transformed into a menacing labyrinth at night. Twice, Silas stumbled, his legs threatening to give out. Each time, Ilara held him steady, her own fatigue a dull ache in her bones. This was no longer just about compassion. It was about survival, a shared struggle that bound them together more tightly than any spoken words. Suddenly, from the valley below, a dog barked, a sharp hunting sound that echoed unnervingly. They froze, melting into the shadow of a large boulder. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She scanned the darkness, searching for the pinprick of a lantern, listening for the thud of hooves. There was nothing but the wind and the fading echo of the bark. Were they out there? Was Thompson's posse already sweeping the area? After a long, breathless moment, they pressed on, the close call lending a new, frantic energy to their pace. Finally, etched against the charcoal sky on a low ridge, they saw it, the skeletal frame of the old line shack. It was listing to one side, a dark wound on the landscape. Pushing open the groaning, weather-beaten door, they stumbled inside, enveloped by the smell of old wood and dust. Ilara slumped against the wall, her lungs burning, while Silas collapsed onto the dirt floor, finally safe for now. Down in the valley, Sheriff Thompson's suspicion festered into a cold, hard certainty. He wheeled his horse around and rode back toward the faint light of Ilara's homestead, his jaw set like granite. The silence that greeted him was different this time, not the quiet of a woman sleeping, but the hollow emptiness of abandonment. He dismounted, shoving the cabin door open with a splintering crack. It was empty. The rug was askew, the cellar door left slightly ajar, a final, silent confession. A vein pulsed in Thompson's temple. This wasn't just about an escaped outlaw, it was a personal affront. She had looked him in the eye and lied. He grabbed the kerosene can from beside the stove, its sloshing contents a promise of retribution. He unscrewed the cap and began to splash the fuel with methodical fury. Over the simple wooden table, the hand-stitched quilts on the cot, the very floorboards that had hidden his quarry. He stepped back onto the porch, struck a match, and tossed it through the doorway. The flames erupted with a hungry roar, instantly consuming the dry timber. From their vantage point in the hills, the sudden, violent bloom of light tore through the darkness, catching Ilara's eye. She scrambled to a gap in the shack's wall, her heart seizing. Silas followed, his face grim. Below them, a pillar of fire clawed at the night sky, a horrific beacon where her home had stood just hours before. Every memory, every connection to the life she had known, was turning to ash. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of defeat. As she watched the flames, a new, steely resolve forged itself in the heat of her loss. Thompson hadn't just burned her cabin. He had burned away her past, leaving nothing behind to hold her back. Now her fate was irrevocably tied to the man beside her. She was a fugitive, too. The pale morning light filtered through the cracks in the line shack, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Outside, a thin column of smoke still rose from the valley, a gray tombstone marking where Ilara's life used to be. The raw grief from the night before had cooled into something harder, something resilient. She looked at Silas, his face etched with guilt. "This is my fault, Ilara," he said, his voice raspy. "I brought this on you." She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the distant smoke. "You didn't hold the march, Silas. Sheriff Thompson did. The cattle baron who framed you owns him, body and soul. They didn't just burn down a cabin. They tried to burn away a witness." Her eyes met his, clear and fierce. Now they have two. A new resolve settled between them. This was no longer just about his survival. It was about their justice. Silas, emboldened by her strength, revealed his plan. The cattle baron, Thorn, had not only framed him, but had also hidden the cattle he'd stolen from other small ranchers in a secluded box canyon, rebranding them with Silas's family mark. The proof was there, waiting. Their only hope was to bypass the corrupt sheriff entirely. Circuit Judge Miller was due in the county seat in 3 days. They wouldn't ride into town. Instead, they'd intercept him on the open road. 3 days later, hidden in a rocky outcrop, they watched the judge's carriage approach. Stepping out onto the trail, they raised their hands, a desperate and defiant act. The judge's guards leveled their rifles, but Ilara's steady voice cut through the tension. They didn't plead for mercy, they offered proof. Intrigued, the judge listened, his sharp eyes assessing their story. He agreed. Following Silas's directions, the judge and his men were led to the hidden canyon. There, just as Silas had said, were the stolen cattle, their hides a damning ledger of Thorn's crimes. With the Baron's guilt laid bare, Thompson's fate was sealed along with his master's. Standing on the ridge overlooking the canyon, the Montana wind whipping at her clothes, Ilara felt a sense of finality. Her past was ashes, but beside Silas, she saw the foundation of a new life, one they would build together, forged in fire and rooted in justice.